One of the things we've mentioned a number of times is the idea of a design log. This seems sort of obvious, but it's actually really hard to do. You're in the middle of stuff, you're on the phone, you're typing emails, you're doing all this stuff, you're kind of keeping lots of things going, you're multitasking, and then this little nagging thing in your head is saying, wait, somebody told me to keep a design log. And you have to remember to stop what you're doing. You just had a phone call with the client, they asked you to make a change. You got to go and keep track of that. You're not necessarily putting a lot of information in. What you're really focusing on is what was the change, so a quick little description. It might be bigger if it's important and more like a paragraph or something, but it could be just a couple of words like take the second stair out and replace it with this, something like that. Who it was that made that request, and in this case you'll notice that it's actual names. Typically, if there's a lot of people involved, it might be names and then the association that they have. So if it's somebody who works for the client, you'd see the client name there as well. Or if it's somebody that works for the bank, you'd have that information, or a funder, or a code official, or somebody like that. So you have some way of backtracking through this and remembering who was actually requesting what that change was. Potentially, it's even you're keeping track of changes that are being requested by the architects in the office as well. Somebody may come in and review the set. A principal who hasn't been looking at it for a bit comes in and looks and says, I don't like this, I want you to focus more on that, make these changes. You might actually keep track of that here as well, just so that everybody can kind of remember how those changes came about down the road. So we've got the description, we've got who it is that's making that request, and importantly, we have the date. So this is a very key element for a design log. This is 90% of what this is about, is saying, all right, the change that was requested in April. So this particular change was requested in April. That means if we go back and look, if you start seeing stuff that didn't respond to that request in May or June, that means something is not right, that somebody wasn't following the sort of order of operations. Or if somebody starts claiming that, we told you back in February that we wanted this change, and you look at your design log and say, nope, it was actually April 10th. It's a way of just keeping track and, importantly, not just sort of general idea of keeping track, but a litigation sense of keeping track of when decisions were being made. Often you'll find that something that seems incredibly important in this moment while you're on the phone and somebody's making a change and it becomes this important thing and you keep the date, but then down the road other changes overtake it anyway and it doesn't really matter. We're really worried about one thing, we go along, and then it turns out the client says, we don't have enough money for that entire wing anyway, so we're just taking that whole thing off. So a lot of these will end up being non-issues. It won't really matter. That's not what you're worried about. What you're worried about are the few that might become problems down the road. You're always hoping for the best, that the project has no problems, there's no litigation, there's no arbitration, everything's going to be happy and everybody's going to love the project. That's what you're hoping, and that's good, but you also have to prepare if anything does go wrong. And this is what you're doing when you're preparing for what goes wrong. So you're keeping track of the information, so if somebody is asking you 3 years down the road, in some court or in some arbitration setting, that, well, why did this decision get made? You can look back at this log and say, well, that decision was made by A. Brown, and they wanted to get rid of this, and it was approved by such and such. Now, one of the things you'll find when you do these kinds of lists is that, first of all, the list will get pretty long because there's a lot of changes that are going on. And also the date submitted, that information will all get sort of put into place. These other ones about date approved and did the decision, is it pending, is it get approved, that kind of thing, often it'll take a while for that to become sort of officially put in. And so sometimes that gets put in, sometimes it doesn't. And then in the comment period, you'll see on this example here, the change will have a cost impact of $21,000. Well, it's pretty unusual for somebody to know that kind of number early on in the process. That's something that comes down the road with change orders and conversations about, well, if we don't do this, if we do that, like how much will that cost? So sometimes that kind of information will get put into this if you happen to have that information, but often you don't have that information until much later, and so it's not likely for it to get in here. So lots of different bits of information will get put in, but the key thing is what the change was, who was asking for it, and what that date was. And that's going to be sort of a basis for how you keep track of all that information down the road.